it's an enormous task. Let us start at once. Let us clear the rubble and lay the bricks. And let us do so in the firm conviction that we are building for the future. That never again shall we have to embark upon such a conflict as we recently endured. I solemnly believe that the price of such a folly would be far more than mankind could afford to pay.
England, Holland. Coverage of England's vital World Cup qualifier, plus all the home country's action in Sportsnight, Wednesday at 10 on BBC1. Inspector Alleyn investigates.
You may not take these threats to your life seriously, but I have to.
I hate you.
You're an unfeeling, insensitive blackguard. Your conduct has been beneath contempt.
Could I speak to the Chief Inspector, please? I know how something could be done.
This is very irregular, Chief Inspector.
So is murder, Sir John.
The Inspector Alleyn Mysteries, tonight at 7:30 on BBC1.
Deliberations and cogitations from Lloyd Grossman and guests in 45 minutes on BBC1 in the search for Britain's Masterchef. Now, BBC Television is called to account in BiteBaCk, which includes a discussion on the portrayal of homosexual men and women on television.
Welcome to this month's edition of BiteBaCk, a month in which we've proved once again what a perverse nation we are. After endless complaints about El Dorado, which finally persuaded the BBC to cancel its soap in the sun, its supporters have found their voice. The El Dorado Appreciation Society has written to the Queen, demanding action to save it from its morte horribilis. Perversity too among Panorama viewers, following an edition describing the human cost of defence cuts, including one family who faced life on the breadline because of redundancy. Hundreds of people rang in with offers of money, food and a home for their dog. So far, the fund for Lockie, a Barrow in Furness mongrel, has reached £1,300 and marrowbone jelly for life. But is the BBC perverse in its turn too? Is its national news less than national? We'll be hearing from viewers up and down the country who feel the stories in their areas are ignored at 9 o'clock.
Who actually sets this agenda in terms of national news? Because at the moment we feel that our interests and our voice isn't heard on the national network.
Here in the studio, we'll be asking if BBC programmes are fair to homosexuals and lesbians. Some of our audience think that the corporation has a cliched and negative view of gay people. Others don't want to see homosexuality portrayed as the norm. Well, Alan Yentop, BBC One's new controller, is here to face his critics from both sides of the argument. But we begin with one of the great disappointments of the current television season. It had been a highly successful book at the top of the bestseller lists for more than a year. It had also gone down very well on the radio. It was the inspiration for hundreds of holidaymakers and couples contemplating retirement. And when the BBC decided to make it into a series, it booked one of the most popular actors in television today as its star. Hardly surprising then that it was expected to be a prime-time success by its makers and viewers alike. Sadly, it's flopped.
A Year in Provence was shot on location in France. We didn't make it that far, but at least we managed to sample the Provençal transport system.
This is the classic cheapo French car which the males drive around in, and is virtually a character in A Year in Provence. But however authentic the car may be, or the setting as a whole, it's not enough to make the series work. Millions of people have been switching off.
The storyline is too thin, the characters are too exaggerated, and I just think it fails miserably.
Very, very weak, very lightweight, not good television, wasn't entertaining.
It was a little bit tedious to me, just like watching paint dry, really.
Recently, Ken and Fran Pollard have developed a taste for France. They holidayed there for the first time last year and liked it so much that they've already been back.
You?
I think it was one of our I think it was one of our best holidays.
Yes, I do. I like France. Nice place, nice country.
So, a year in Provence, trailed heavily on TV and in the papers, sounded right up their street.
Come on, Fran, it's starting. We were really, really looking forward to this. Because of all the hype that the BBC put out about it, this was going to be a flagship programme. Awful lot of money spent on this. Big league actors, on location.
But the programme turned out to be a deep disappointment for Ken and Fran.
Creme caramel. Almost white, but not quite.
Mais le blanc, monsieur, mais le blanc, c'est dur. Monsieur Colombani, look, all the bread's like this.
It wasn't funny, there's no drama in it. I mean, who can get excited about whether they have a white loo or not, or whether the bread's a bit soggy?
The series started with the new year and a lot of bad weather. In February, the males need help with a spot of redecorating. And by March, Peter is going native with a gang of truffle hunters. None of this was of any interest to Doreen Brookfield. She was hoping for a rather more picturesque view of life in the rural south of France.
I was really looking forward to the scenery especially. I really thought that would be marvellous. Instead, most of the action seems to take place in this grotty farmhouse. And I was disappointed with John Thor because he seemed to be... his strength, I think, is his underacting. And in this, I think, really, he was sort of playing it like Hamlet, which was quite out of character. And also, I thought, quite out of character for the easygoing chap he was supposed to be portraying, you know.
And as if viewers' complaints weren't enough to turn the producers of A Year in Provence to drink, then the viewing figures might have done the damage instead.
The first programme registered a healthy 14.5 million, but by the seventh programme, they had shrunk to less than half, 6.1 million viewers. And the newspaper reviews were brutal. The Daily Mail called it catastrophe in Provence. For the Sunday Times, it was un absolument disaster. The Sunday Express thought it was painfully unfunny, and for the Sun, it was overhyped tripe. Out on location with Screen 2 is Barry Hansen, head of drama at Pebble Mill Studios. He was the man in charge of A Year in Provence.
79, take 2 inboard. Nothing wrong with that, chaps. Right, check the gate, please. 60 extras down to...
Barry Hansen's successful credits include The Naked Civil Servant and Along Good Friday, but his latest venture has been a switch-off for millions.
I don't think it invalidates the programme. The programme is vastly different to any other programme that is on television at the moment. I mean, it is a European comedy. It is in 2 languages. It's not derivative. It's not got automatic reassurance for an audience that, say, a police series has, or any of the other English genres playing at the moment.
Sewing machine for an engine?
Absolument.
Le Mange in the suspension?
C'est ça.
I think that the stories are charming. They're revealing about the people in the situation. In fact, they're revealing about how you get on in a foreign country. I find it pretty much the way that Peter Mayle described the book, you know, no sex, violence and no gratuitous shopping.
Il y a un petit problème avec cette émission. Les Français parlent français, mais il n'y a pas de sous-titres. Alors, il faut trouver un autre moyen pour traduire en anglais.
So there had to be another way to translate into English.
The answer was to get someone else in to do the translation, which of course was time-consuming and laborious.
What's wrong, Marcel?
Ça ne va pas, Marcel? Regardez, Madame Mel. Regardez, Monsieur Mel. La camionnette du facteur est dans un trou.
He says his van's down a hole.
It is in a bit of a rut, yes. It must be the rain. La pluie, Marcel.
Correct, Monsieur Mel. Seulement le résultat, hein? Observez-le.
But observe the result.
Distribution. Impossible.
He can't reach le box.
It made the pace of the whole of the programme slow and plodding. It just didn't work at all.
They should have either gone for subtitles or just straight French accent type actors.
I think it's probably that you know, a British audience tend to give anything with a foreign language a bit of a hard time.
Well, people have asked why you didn't use subtitles. That would have been the obvious way out of this.
We did consider it. I think subtitles would have drawn attention to it as a foreign language film, and also I don't think we went through very, very meticulously the whole 12 episodes to see whether or not subtitles would add anything to it, and we decided it wouldn't.
Maybe the problem of language overshadows bigger obstacles to successful adaptation. Drama writer Stephen Davis cut his teeth as an assistant on Brideshead Revisited and has just adapted the John Fowles novel Daniel Martin for, as they say, a major motion picture. He feels that the book, with its journalistic style and diary format, is unsuitable for drama.
Outside the cafe, 3 cars had converged and were growling at each other. I think the attraction of the idea of adapting Year in Provence was the worst possible attraction which it could have, which was it was top of the bestseller lists, rather than having some internally compelling dramatic conflict which addresses the times. And I think that a lot of its misfortunes have flowed from this. And I think it's very healthy, the criticism. It's dispiriting for those who've taken part. But I think it shows one thing that I strongly believe in about drama in cinema and in television and theatre, which is that the audience in the end knows best.
I mean, what I can't understand is when they started shooting this and started bringing the film back to London to edit, why this wasn't picked up, that it was all going wrong. Obviously, senior people at the BBC, I mean, an awful lot of money had been spent on this. This is going to be a flagship programme, Sunday night, opposite Darling Buds of May. How on earth people, they must have sat there and watched it, just like we watched it. How anybody can't believe that this wasn't an absolute bomb is beyond me.
It was a little bit like going on a holiday and finding out that the place that you booked for wasn't exactly what you intended, and it was a really, you know, grotty place.
When A Year in Provence was first launched, there was much talk of a second series. Many people will be pleased to hear that's now been dismissed as premature speculation. And tonight, when the 9th episode goes out, it seems there's no way back for the current series from being a critical and ratings flop.
No regrets. No, I will have no regrets.
Richard Jobson reporting. Well, now, do homosexual men and women get a fair deal from the BBC? Are the issues which concern them given enough coverage on the news? Are they fairly represented in plays and comedy shows? Or are they, to quote a leading homosexual activist writing recently to the BBC, only a bunch of queers the BBC deems unworthy of serious reporting, who are, he goes on, fobbed off with tokenistic programmes? Well, that's the discussion our audience here will be having in just a moment with Alleyn Yentob, the newly appointed controller of BBC1, who spent the last 5 years in charge of BBC2, so he's the ideal man to answer the charges as put. The issue has been reignited by the appearance in the last few weeks on Top of the Pops of Shabba Ranks, a superstar of Jamaican music.
If you do not love your lover proper, then I'll be jumping through your window.
Ranks has become notorious recently for his extreme views on homosexuality. He went so far as to say on a Channel 4 pop programme that gays deserve to be crucified. To the fury of gay and lesbian rights groups, Ranks has twice appeared on Top of the Pops since making his ill-considered remarks. The BBC is irresponsible to promote the image and influence of such a man, they say. It's colluding with homophobia. The corporation is no stranger, of course, to criticism of the way in which it deals with homosexual matters. Remember that kiss in Albert Square?
Well, Colin, still wish marriage was an option? Oh, no way. Fancy a nightcap? Why not? Usual? Please. 2 minutes. Right. Good night. Good night.
When Guido kissed Colin in EastEnders 4 years ago, it was said to be the first peak-time television kiss between two men, and there was a cry of outrage from a group of MPs. It was a perverted practice and not for family viewing, said one. Soap producers were not deterred. Eldorado's brought us Freddie and Xavier.
I shouldn't have come. I'll go.
Wait.
But this time the criticism comes from the gays themselves. The characters are negative, they say. Freddie is a miserable, isolated figure. Xavier was closet. He couldn't come to terms with his sexuality.
No. Not today, Freddie.
Negative, too, are camp comedy characters such as Mr. Humphreys in Grace and Favour and the constant innuendo in the script. Negative, too, say gay people who've rung in have been birds of a feather who've alluded to puffs and Nancy boys.
Look, just because Richard is a sensitive, nicely spoken 17-year-old puffter.
And Casualty, which featured the gang rape of a rent boy. So where are the positive and unexaggerated images of homosexuals who've come to terms with themselves and the world? Over on BBC2, perhaps?
I'm gay. I'm gay.
The Screen 2 drama Lost Language of the Cranes, broadcast just over a year ago, showed an average young man from an average family throwing off his gay guilt and telling the truth.
And it's not just a question of homosexuality, it's a question of secrets.
The award-winning Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit was an earlier BBC 2 drama which contained a sympathetic and tender portrayal of lesbian love.
I went out with a boy once. All he did was push me up against the back fence and wriggle a lot.
And 18 months ago, BBC 2 devoted a whole evening of programmes to gay issues. They called it Saturday Night Out. So have the gay critics got it wrong? Perhaps they do get a fair deal across the board, too good in the view of some people. In which case, was putting Shabba Ranks on top of the pops an isolated misjudgment? Let's start with Alan Yentop and that specific point. Do you think it was wrong to give him airtime, to promote him, Alan?
I don't think we did promote him. I think he appeared on Top of the Pops and he was, I think, #2 in the charts, and it's almost without question that such a figure goes on. He didn't. What he said was not endorsed, and of course he is a deeply objectionable figure. A nasty piece of work, I dare say.
But don't you increase his popularity by putting him on the telly?
No, I don't think you do in that sense. And I think also the judgment of whether you ban people from television is one that the BBC takes, and most broadcasters would take very seriously. And in this situation, the head of department, the producer, and everyone else concerned thought this was not the occasion to do so.
Nick Kirby, what do you think of that response?
I mean, in the light of the fact that you said that it was a nasty piece of work, you still actually allowed him to go on. What I would like to suggest to you is that were Adolf Hitler alive today, you wouldn't allow him on Top of the Pops singing The Sound of Music. I know what you're saying.
But it's not what he does, it's not his act, to be, or wasn't his act.
I know, but the whole point is that with the media hysteria that went with what Shabba Ranks said, everybody who read the tabloids, who listened to the radio, knew what Shabba Ranks had said, knew that he was anti-gay, yet the BBC1 allowed him to go on Top of the Pops, and therefore, I mean, it's understandable that they can be seen to be
Okay, but we've heard his answer on that. Let's just broaden it out a bit. And Sarah Graham, what do you think of the way homosexuality is represented on the screen as you see it?
Well, my contention is this, Sue, that if an alien landed in Britain and were to watch the BBC's soap, comedy and drama for 2 weeks, she would conclude two things. Firstly, that there are hardly any lesbians and gays in British society. And secondly, that all gay men are really camp, like Mr. Humphreys' character in Grace and Favour, and that all lesbian women are really butch, like Sissy in You Rang My Lord.
Do others of you find the Mr. Humphreys' character offensive? Who else finds that offensive?
It's not so much offensive. I mean, all of these things get out of proportion when there is such underrepresentation. You've had to go back how many years to find a handful of examples, most of which are not particularly accurate to the average gay guy or lesbian in the street. Your introduction used the wrong language. You know, until we start using the right language and start seeing a real wide diversity of gay and lesbian people, there's going to be distortion.
Not that people aren't trying, though. I mean, and I think you would give that point. I mean, people try to use the right language. People try to represent it. Alan, address the point, if you will, about the camp cliched comedy queen figure. Isn't it boring?
Well, that's a figure that comes from the music hall. And in fact, as you know, those two comedies are written by the same writer, and one who also wrote Dad's Army and a great many, and in which he, in a sense, the caricatures also to some extent exists there, and I think it's affectionately done. However, I can quite understand that some people believe that sort of camp mincing representation, if it is, as you say, uniquely what you see on television, is one that would worry you. But I would say that certainly in lots of areas in British television, certainly on the channel that I was running, which I have some intimate knowledge of, there was a very robust representation of gay people and their interests, and that portrayal was very fair and not cliched.
Peter Tatchell,
there are dozens of
do you accept that view?
I think in drama there have been some very creditable BBC television programmes. I think one of the real problem areas, though, is news and current affairs, where lesbian and gay issues and concerns are systematically underrepresented. In our society today, homosexual people can be sacked from their jobs, they have their children taken away from them by the courts, they can be arrested for consenting behaviour, they can be denied the right to marry the person they love. Now, if these kind of things were happening to black or Jewish people, there would be a national outcry, and the BBC would be making lots of programmes to expose this terrible injustice. As it happens, the flagship programme like Panorama has never, in my lifetime, made one single programme about the violation of homosexual human rights, and Newsnight and other programmes have also failed to address the issue.
Let Alan answer.
Public Eye has recently tackled the issue of gay people and their rights in Britain, and that's a current affairs programme, and very recently. On a number of social affairs programmes, but I'm not now talking about the news, though. The news is the news, and essentially, if you don't read it on the front pages, or at least the second or third pages of your newspapers, you're not going to read it or see it on BBC Television's 9 o'clock news. That's an issue to be opened up, that's fair enough, but I think in all kinds of programmes elsewhere, you don't see homosexuals caricatured, and they're part of a representation of Britain as we see it, and I think we've got much better at that.
But are homosexuals, would you say, Martin Corbett, more caricatured than, say, Jewish people or black people? That is entirely accepted as unacceptable, isn't it?
The thing is that if you look at a black person, you see a black person. If you look at that black person may very well be gay. You look at anybody can be gay. Is that we don't walk around with homosexual, lesbian or gay on our lapels. Unless people actually say that they're gay, you wouldn't know. So that these programmes are biased in that way.
You see, I wasn't actually saying that we shouldn't have characters like Mr. Humphreys. I actually really enjoy him. The problem is that we don't have the diversity of people. Lesbians and gays, as Martin said, come in all shapes and sizes, all colours. We're people's neighbours, their brothers, their sisters, in some cases mothers.
What percentage of the population are you?
Who knows? I mean, I think the research is very contradictory. I don't think that's the issue. Everybody knows somebody who's lesbian or gay.
But is that an issue
we don't
for
see
you?
Those people.
Now, as controller of BBC1, of the mainstream channel, Alan, you've got to try and please a lot of the people a lot of the time. I mean, in a sense, doesn't it matter what percentage you are addressing in trying to find the way through this
In the sense
dilemma?
that it certainly matters, in the sense that we wish to represent the British Isles and the British people properly on television, and to that extent different minorities need to be seen and need to be fairly represented. Now, sometimes we don't get it right, but quite a lot of the time these days I think we do, and I think to that extent, you know, without quoting numbers, I think that you do see quite often, for instance, on an arts program, and you may say, well, arts programs are arts programs, but there are many homosexual writers, the very best of them, represent their views and are given considerable status. And on a show like The Late Show, you also see a lot of coverage.
But more those arts programs and The Late Show and so on are on BBC Two. I mean, what we're really now talking about is how mainstream is mainstream. Let me bring in Karen here. Karen Whitcomb, your point, please.
Yes. It's about the Jack and Ori, the children's story, which was read by Christian Smith, which covered homosexuality and HIV, virus and AIDS. Don't you feel that that was rather over the top for that sort of age group?
I'm not sure what it was, actually. I mean, the circumstances are very complicated, and they do take these things seriously. The fact is that AIDS is a huge epidemic in our society. It affects families, it affects children, it affects people's lives, and I think that depends on the context in which it's presented. And I think that there aren't issues that you know, are inappropriate. It's not a question of simply a watershed issue. It is not, but it needs to be handled in the right way. And I don't suppose this is not an issue you see tackled every day on Jack and Ori, I'm sure.
Yes, but Jack and Ori is a children's story. The children of the age that will be watching Jack and Ori are not even aware of any kind of sexuality of their own. That they watch Jack and Ori because perhaps they're unable to read a book themselves. They're 4, 5, 6 years old. That sort of age group, they don't need to know about it.
But there are people that beyond that point, if I may just take it on a little bit, because we're slightly pressed for time. I mean, there are people here who believe that homosexuality in any form should not appear on the screen at all, should not be represented for one moment and should not be accepted as part of the norm. I think, Mr. Stevens, you're of that opinion.
Yes, I think that the whole fundamental thing is that the BBC ought to consider its charter. I'll just remind you of the words in the annex to the licence and the agreement, and it's signed, after all, by the chairman and the general director. The board accept that, so far as possible, the programmes for which they are responsible should not offend against good taste or decency, or be likely to encourage or incite to crime, lead to disorder, I'm nearly finished,
yes,
or be an offence to public opinion.
But that brings up the point, really, doesn't it, that as controller of BBC1, Alan, you have got to try and please, as I said, a lot of the people a lot of the time. There are, obviously, I'm sure Mr. Stevens represents quite a large tranche of the community, of society, as well as other people here do. How do you please him at the same time as trying to educate people about homosexuality?
By taking an attitude which is about representing a fair portrayal of Britain today, and that doesn't mean that we should encourage homophobia. There are large numbers of people in Britain who live lives in which their sexual practices are their own concern, and I don't think there is any sense in which you could say that the BBC encourages or proselytizes for a kind of for anything in this sense. You know, we are there to represent fairly and accurately that world, you know.
So are you there to reflect society, or are you there to lead it, to educate it, as it
Very tricky, that one, isn't it? You know, I mean, I think essentially we are there, we're not there to lead society in that way. We're there, and we're not there, we can't please everyone all the time, but we are there to give a fair reflection of that society.
Let me call in Jill Gordon, sitting on the back there, because you have a very particular reason, don't you, for wanting people to be educated about homosexuality?
Yes, our son is gay, and when I first found out, or before I found out about my son, I was extremely homophobic. If anything came on the television to do with homosexuality, gays, anything like that, I would switch it off with disgust. Now, having understood my son's sexuality, I can now be understanding and tolerant about the whole situation, and I think that it needs to be brought out into the open on television, and I think Alan is doing an extremely good job for the huge issue that is involved.
A quick point, Peter Tatchell.
In many ways, the portrayal of lesbian and gay people is where the portrayal of women and black people was on BBC television 20 years ago. Yes, there are good programmes like Public Eye or First Sight, just last week, about policing the gay community. But the problem is they're exceptions to the rule.
No,
and all we're saying is we want to see our issues and the really gross violations of our human rights treated as serious news issues.
Tony Whitehead, do you think that homosexual and gay people get a fair deal from the BBC?
No, I don't. I mean, actually, Mr. Yentop's point show that the intentions and integrity is there, but I fear that the BBC, certainly BBC1, does not really grasp the nettle, that the mere existence of homosexuality does offend some people, and it's got to make a stand on that much more than it does. It's not just about issues of news that are serious and affecting the gay community, but as characters, I want to see something of life as I know it reflected in television. And life as I know it contains gay people, where being gay is not the issue, and HIV and AIDS is not the issue. They happen to be gay people participating in life's dramas, and I'd like more of that in BBC.
Alan, just to finish, how much do you think about these matters, and how much do you fear that because the pressure groups are as strong as they are, you might be pushed into being into allowing more homosexual characters and more portrayals on the screen than the mass of the audience of the mainstream channel would like ideally?
I think the fair representation of people in Britain is a very important one, and that's one we should strive for in our fiction and our factual programming on both our channels.
Alleyn Yentob, thank you very much indeed. Well, now the hit list. I'll run around the course of some of your other comments and complaints. And this month, the Scots who were forced to swap golf for Gaelic, racism at the races, and a booby prize for BAFTA.
The dancers were rubbish.
The catwalk and marathon.
And Mel Gibson was more like a lethal weapon, according to some viewers of the prestigious BAFTA Awards ceremony on BBC1.
Kathy Bates for fried green tomatoes at the Whistle Stop Cafe. Short pause. Wrong picture. I'll give them all the time to show the VT they want. Shall I tell you?
We can play in the clips now.
Sue Farnston from London complained, "What an embarrassing mess. This fell far below BBC standards. The programme was either unrehearsed or made by incompetence. As for the dancers, please save us from this kind of cliched rubbish. Pathetic, the whole thing."
Producer Peter Hilton Cleaver explained, "The real embarrassment of the evening was caused by Mel Gibson failing to read all nominations, forgetting the last and most important nomination of Miranda Richardson for the film Damage, which was the winning one. She was on the other end of the satellite in New York and was confused when she didn't hear her nomination. Mel Gibson ignored all the floor manager's instructions to read it out. In the end, we ran the film clip so that order could be restored on both sides of the Atlantic."
They're off.
No, they're not.
They're definitely off this time.
No, they're not.
Like the turf, insults were flying at the Grand National, but it was the Irish who were most upset.
Like then it all started. I go point to point in Ireland, you know, a backward little country like Ireland.
Backward, eh? Cried Cork-born Tom O'Callaghan, now living in Lim near Manchester. Trainer John Upson made a scandalous slur on our good name. The racing highlight of the year goes completely wrong, cock-ups all over the place, and who gets the flack? The Irish.
John Upson admitted his joke fell at the first fence. He told BiteBaCk, "I was being ironic. We can't even start a horse race at Aintree. What I meant was that people mock the Irish, but at least they can start a horse race. The last thing I want to do is offend the Irish."
While the rest of the nation's golf fans settled down to enjoy live coverage of the Masters tournament from America, the Scots were well teed off. They got this. Hogmanay songs, in April, and in Gaelic. Lowlander Anita Thompson felt like a foreigner. Scotland's a home of golf, and I'm as Scottish as they come. I don't speak Gaelic, I don't understand Gaelic, and I don't want it on my TV. Hardly anyone understands it. The rest of the country enjoyed live golf. We got foreign language New Year songs. What is going on?
Colin Cameron, head of BBC Scotland, told BiteBaCk, "The Gaelic language is as significant a part of Scottish culture as golf, and just as worthy of celebration. We did show recorded golf coverage. I'm sorry if Anita felt disenfranchised. Others in Scotland did not."
Richard Jobson and Carol Peters voicing your views and the BBC's replies. Well, Carol has also been investigating a more widespread complaint that's come to our notice. Over the past months, we've been receiving an increasing number of letters and calls from people who feel the BBC News ignores or diminishes the issues that concern them, like the people of Warrington, who found the bomb outrage that devastated their city taking second place on the 9 o'clock news that very night to the latest political developments in Moscow. The suspicion among some viewers is that there's a foreign or a metropolitan bias in the judgment of those who decide which stories are carried, where in the running order, and for how long.
We cut to VTD, TX, Waco on VTD. 15 seconds to air. Counting to the programme. In 10, 9,
Stand by Sam with the opening
7,
rumble, stand by
6,
lights, stand by
5,
anchor lobby, please.
4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Cue.
The BBC has a new set and a new logo, but it doesn't always have the kind of news coverage that its viewers want.
Who actually sets this agenda in terms of national news? Because at the moment we feel that our interests and our voice isn't heard on the national network.
When I'm watching the BBC News, there is obviously this north-south divide.
Why isn't Scotland given its rightful place in the so-called national news?
This is BBC Radio Scotland, the national network. It's 1 o'clock. The 1 o'clock news with John Milne. The main stories this Monday lunchtime. The Timex strikers.
We have a dispute going on in Dundee at the present moment with the Timex company. Now this is an ongoing dispute that's been on for several weeks. They've been on strike probably for about 6 weeks, I would think, and this has not been noted nationally at all.
The violence broke out when 2 buses carrying the alternative Timex workforce tried to breach picket lines of sacked workers and their supporters.
The dispute at Timex started at the beginning of January, and although it received extensive coverage in Scotland, the story only made it onto the national news when it escalated.
Within the last 2 weeks, support came from all parts of Scotland, including militant support, and this created an atmosphere of so-called violence on the picket line. That suddenly became national news.
I think that's probably a fair criticism. I wish we would have done Timex slightly earlier, though I note that very few other people picked it up earlier outside Scotland. It's true that if you look at it now, the dispute has all kinds of implications and meanings for trade union legislation, the organisation of labour, which give it that extra degree of something that makes it more than simply a Scottish story, and I wish we would have picked it up earlier.
When you realise that all the BBC's national news emanates from this newsroom here at Television Centre in London, it's easy to understand why some viewers believe that there is a south-east bias. It's 10:30 in the morning, and the 9 o'clock news team are in their first meeting of the day. It's now that decisions will be taken on what stories should make it into tonight's bulletin. But decisions change throughout the day, and not all stories decided on here will make it onto tonight's news.
But I don't know. I'm interested to see what...
Extremists, can you take it on? Sure. I mean, we're really very proud of it.
Sort of growing shift.
National and regional stories are way down the agenda. It's stories from abroad, events in South Africa and Bosnia that are top of the early news list. The BBC prides itself on its foreign news coverage. And last year, more than half the lead stories on the 9 o'clock news were foreign.
And then we've got 19 people killed last night in Sebeke.
As things stand, the 2 obviously dominant stories remain as they were when I came in this morning. One, the funeral of Chris Harney, and the second story remains the story about British and Western policy towards Bosnia. Heaven knows what might happen, and it's perfectly possible between now and 9 o'clock a domestic story, even dare I say it, a regional story of some kind, may make the headlines.
Oh, hi, Richard. Wearmouth Colliery, and there's 1 dead. Is that a miner?
The BBC's regional newsrooms are in constant contact with London, offering their lead stories to the network.
With one miner or contractor dead and 1 injured.
Although the 9 o'clock news team is interested in the death of a miner in the northeast, the story will be dropped from the running order before tonight's news.
Right, OK. How soon can we get Newcastle? 5:15.
Up on Tyneside, they feel they get a poor deal from London. One of the biggest news stories to come out of the northeast this year was the murder of a policeman.
Has been named as Sergeant Bill Forth, who was 34 and married with 2 children.
The story received extensive coverage locally, but was given just 23 seconds on the BBC's national news, a decision that incensed many viewers.
Well, I think the feeling here was that that was a major story in terms of British society, a policeman carrying out his duties in such a manner, and the appalling tragedy that occurred. And the feeling was that it dominated this region's headlines quite inevitably and naturally for a good 2 days or so, and yet the national network hardly were prepared to even cover it, we felt. I think it's because the agenda is set in southern England, in London itself, and there's a perception down there that the world really does more or less end at Watford Gap.
There are some stories in the regions which are very important in that area, but which, when looked at from the perspective of a programme with 25 minutes, which has got to contain everything of importance that happens in the world that day, unfortunately doesn't get reported, although it may well be reported in a regional news programme. Our resources are stretched. We work with a fixed number of camera crews and with a fixed number of reporters and so on, and we can't always get them out and about around the country to the extent that we would like.
The President is keeping very much on top of this situation. He's being informed periodically by his senior staff, including White House Chief of Staff Mac McClarty.
6 o'clock, and news of a fire at the Waco siege in Texas changes the running order dramatically. The news team hold an impromptu conference.
Hello, Newsroom Southeast. Yeah, it's Laurie Margolis at the Spur. Read the Waco story. There was a man in Winchmore Hill.
Items are dropped from the list, others are squeezed as room is made for the big breaking story.
BI appeared to have no...
The Waco fire just makes it onto the news in time.
Good evening. 86